T-sequence narratives has a way of holding on to the quieter edges of experience. Late at night, some stories seem to settle here without needing to explain themselves. A few listeners tend to stay connected here. This story rests on the feeling of being seen less each day. At first, nothing announced itself as different. The days arrived the same way they always had, with ordinary sounds and familiar routines. Conversations still happened, names were still spoken, but there was a subtle shift in how long the eye lingered, in how often someone looked up when you entered a room. It wasn't absence, it was reduction. Messages were answered, but later than before. Responses were shorter, trimmed of small details that once filled the space between words. When you spoke, people nodded, but their attention drifted somewhere just past your shoulder, as if something more important was waiting behind you. You noticed it in reflections first, not mirrors, but moments. The way a group photo was taken without anyone asking you to step closer. The way plans were discussed as though you were already aware, even when no one had told you. There was no confrontation to point to, no argument that could be replayed, just a gradual thinning of presence, like a sound fading without ever fully stopping. You began adjusting without realizing it, speaking a little less, waiting an extra beat before adding your thoughts, then letting the moment pass when it didn't arrive. You told yourself it didn't matter. You told yourself everyone goes through quieter stretches, but the pattern continued. Invitations arrived later, sometimes after decisions had already been made. When you were included, it felt procedural, like checking a box rather than extending a hand. You were there, technically, present officially, yet something essential had slipped out of alignment. At night, you replayed conversations searching for the moment you might have missed. A sentence spoken too softly, a joke that didn't land, a pause that lasted 1 second longer than it should have. Nothing stood out enough to explain the change. Being seen less each day doesn't happen all at once. It happens in increments small enough to doubt, small enough to make you question your own perception. You wondered if you were imagining it, if the distance you felt was simply fatigue or mood. But the feeling persisted. People remembered things about you less accurately. Preferences blurred, stories you'd told before were repeated back to you incorrectly, as though details had been filled in by assumption rather than memory. You corrected them at first, gently. Later, you stopped. There was a particular quiet that settled in when you realized no one noticed you had gone silent. The space you left remained unchanged. Conversations continued without adjusting their shape. You started observing more than participating, watching how attention moved around a room, how it clustered and dissolved. You learned how visibility worked without ever being taught. Who was leaned toward, who was interrupted, who was waited for, and who wasn't. The strange part was that nothing about you had changed dramatically. You were still there, still doing what you'd always done, still showing up, yet the way you were received grew faint, like a signal losing strength. Some days you experimented. You spoke more clearly. You dressed with intention. You made yourself noticeable in small ways just to see if it registered. Sometimes it did, briefly, a glance, a comment. Then things returned to their quieter state. It wasn't rejection. Rejection has edges you can feel. This was more like erosion, gradual, patient, difficult to accuse. You noticed how often you were thanked now for things that used to be expected, as if your presence had shifted categories, from integral to optional, from assumed to acknowledged. When you left a room, no one asked where you were going. There were moments when being unseen felt almost peaceful, a relief from expectation. You could move through spaces without explanation, without being pulled into conversations you didn't choose. But the relief never lasted. It always gave way to something heavier, a sense of thinning. You wondered if this was how people drifted out of their own lives without physically leaving, not through dramatic exits, but through quiet recalibration, a slow reassignment of importance that no one announced. Sometimes, late at night, You imagined what it would be like to disappear completely, not out of sadness, but curiosity. Would the change be noticed at all, or would it blend seamlessly into the existing pattern? In the morning, those thoughts softened, but the underlying awareness remained. You were still there, still present, still breathing in the same rooms, yet your outline felt less defined. Being seen less each day teaches you things you didn't ask to learn: how to listen without being acknowledged, how to occupy space without claiming it, how to carry yourself when recognition no longer arrives automatically. There was no conclusion waiting at the end of this realization, no clear decision, just the ongoing experience of existing slightly to the side of where attention naturally settled. And so the days continued. You showed up, you spoke when it felt necessary, you stayed quiet when it didn't. The world adjusted around you without comment, and you adjusted in return. Not disappearing, just fading at the edges. Some feelings don't announce themselves when they linger. If this moved through you quietly, some listeners leave a like, others subscribe, or share a thought in the comments. You've been listening to T-Sequence Narratives. Some moments don't end, they just stop being spoken about.